start. Continue.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today on our virtual brown bag. The College of Engineering is always excited to bring you information and presenters and hopefully some things that you might not always get a chance to see otherwise. Today's topic is academic integrity, and our speaker is Dan Moore from the Office of Community Standards. They are the office that deals with academic integrity issues here at the university. Dan is going to give us a presentation, and then we'll have opportunities for questions at the end. So if you have questions, remember you can put them into the chat window, and we will then use those questions to ask after the end of the presentation. Feel free to put your questions in as we go along. So put the questions in any time, we'll get to them at the end. So that'll be perfectly okay. All right, and Dan, we're glad you're here with us. Oh, I forgot to introduce myself. Hi, I'm Dr. Carter Tiernan, Assistant Dean in the college. But I'm going to turn it over to Dan now, and he's going to walk you through a good bit of information about academic integrity here at UT Arlington.
All right, I really appreciate it. I appreciate being here with you all. And so I want to take the time today to try to give an overview of academic integrity in general, but also more specifically to things that we see that come out of the College of Engineering. And so as we're getting into this, I've been working with students for many, many years, have had just countless conversations with students who have had to go through the conduct process because they had some kind of academic misconduct violation. And so, you know, there are a lot of similar themes that run through a lot of those conversations. And so, you know, at that point, there are many students that, you know, describe what happened. They'll talk about, you know, I didn't think that like this would happen, or I didn't think that, you know, this could be the impact to me. I didn't think about how, you know, now I'm concerned, will this impact me about being able to apply to graduate school or not? Or I didn't think, you know, maybe my friend might get in trouble also as we were doing this. And so the, you know, the theme between all of those is this idea of just kind of not thinking the decisions through in the first place. And so some of you all may have heard of a person named Douglas Adams. For those who have, it's likely because you're familiar. He wrote The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. If you haven't read it, it's a very entertaining book. But one of the things that he also did, he traveled the world with a zoologist, and they were looking at all of these exotic animals. And so they put out this book after they had finished this adventure of theirs. And so I pulled this out because I think it relates back a little bit to what we're talking about. And so this was just an observation that he made, that human beings who are almost unique and having the ability to learn from the experience of others are also remarkable for their apparent disinclination to do so. And so my purpose for being here today is also to help you all learn from the mistakes of others so that you can avoid them yourself. Recognizing that that may not always happen, but to try to, I think everybody I've ever talked to, the number of students that have told me, you know, this wasn't as bad as I thought it would be. You were very nice, but I hope I never see you again. And that I wish I hadn't had to have gone through this in the first place. And so at UTA, we have an honor code, and you are going to see this in the classrooms around campus, on the syllabi. Really at its base, this is an affirmation statement that we want students as a community to promise that they are going to submit work that they personally created or contributed to, and that if they're using information from other sources, that they are going to give appropriate credit to those other sources. Now, the policy in the handbook that students would actually be held accountable for is going to be your academic misconduct policy. And so it's in the Handbook of Operating Procedures. It is divided into 3 subsections: cheating, plagiarism, and collusion. And we're going to cover pieces of all 3 of these. Plagiarism and collusion, those definitions are pretty short and succinct. And about everything else that didn't fit in those 2 kind of got lumped under the umbrella of cheating. But essentially what we're looking at is the academic misconduct policy as a whole. And so this is not a word-for-word replication. What I did was I pulled out some of the more pertinent sections to paraphrase so that it would more appropriately fit on the slides for you all, so that you have this information. And so I want to talk about some of those kind of more common things that we tend to see. Now, when I talk to groups of students and I ask, give me an example of what constitutes cheating. And so some of the things that you will see on the screen are very common examples that are given, copying somebody else's work or copying somebody else's exam answers, trying to use a cheat sheet during an exam when your professor does not allow that, sending somebody else to take a test for you. And so these are pretty common examples that students will give. I want to cover also some of the things you may not consider. And so, for example, like obtaining or attempting to obtain an exam that's not provided by your instructor. You may read that and think, oh, well, sure, I shouldn't go into my professor's office and steal the exam off their desk. But does that also include if you're in a GroupMe thread for the class and somebody starts sending out exam answers? You, in a sense, could be obtaining that exam when not provided by your instructor. We can talk about some of the nuances to this, and I also want to make sure that we talk about preventive steps that you can take in some of these situations. But being mindful that, using our GroupMe as an example, like students would be prohibited from seeking aid when not permitted by the instructor. So please don't take a picture of your test and send it out on the GroupMe and say, hey, does anybody know the answer to number 3? I'm not sure. Because even if nobody responds to you, or even if they give you the wrong answer, you are still responsible for trying to get those exam answers when your professor is not allowing you to do so. And so just being mindful of some of these things. A very common example that most students are not aware of is the resubmission of work that you have already submitted previously for credit. Now, you can resubmit work that you have submitted before, but you have to get your professor's permission to do so. This comes up, I would say, more often than not when students are retaking a class, either because they withdrew from it the first time or because they didn't pass it the first time and now they're having to retake it. It also can come up where a student, let's use an example, may write, a paper when taking History 1301, and then they take History 1302, and they have an assignment that they think, oh, I can reuse my whole paper from the previous class or part of it from the previous class, and I'm just going to copy and paste that in. By default, you would not be permitted to do that. You need to ask your professor if you can. Now, some faculty may say, sure, I don't mind. Some may say, no, absolutely not. It has to be all original. And some may say, you know what, you can reuse it, but I want you to build off of it. And I want to be able to see what that looks like. And so at the end of the day, you need to ask in advance. If you are falsifying research data that you're supposed to be gathering, would be a violation. If you're posting unauthorized materials to websites like Course Hero, most students, if you have not already been aware of Course Hero before you came to the university, I would say by this point in the semester, you probably are aware of it at this point. And so knowing that you would not be permitted to do that. I also get contacted by a lot of faculty who are unhappy when they find their own materials posted on these sites, like their lecture slides and lecture notes. And I know publishers would be unhappy with some of their materials being posted. And so I would suggest some of those sites just staying off of altogether, but please don't upload your work to it. Now, within the College of Engineering, I want to use like GitHub as an example. Now, there's a difference here in that recognizing that GitHub is used within industry, that it is a great place that if you like, it would, it makes sense for students to upload like code that they have written to GitHub as a way to showcase, almost like a portfolio, to be able to show potential employers like these are the kinds of things that I can do. And so I would still want to be able to encourage that because that is going to be helpful for you as you are graduating and looking for employment or potentially like graduate programs. And so you want to be able to showcase those things. You want to be able to showcase your skills and your creativity. How at the same time are we going to do that, but also try to protect, the academic integrity with the university? And so this is where I think taking some precautions as you do it is helpful. Now, I know some faculty will address this proactively with their classes and say, you know what, I don't mind if you are uploading your assignments to GitHub, but you are not permitted to do that until the course is over. That way, everybody who is doing these assignments, nobody is able to just go online and see what somebody else in the class had just completed. They still need to be able to do the work on their own. And so being mindful of what your faculty's expectations are is going to be important. The other piece that I would add is as you upload that, I would remove references to like a particular assignment. So for example, if you're going to upload your code and you wrote that for a specific assignment, go ahead and upload the code, but take out the reference that it was to a specific assignment. For instance, if a student was trying to find an example of the assignment itself, they might search for like that assignment name. And as long as you have then taken that off where that's not showing up, it makes it harder for a student to then find your code and copy it. And so what my hope is that you can use it, for employment purposes and everything, but you're still, doing a part to try to uphold the academic integrity for the institution. Now, plagiarism, you probably are going to think of that more in terms of like courses where you're going to do a lot of writing. So like English courses, history courses, where you're going to have these papers, these research papers where you're drawing on a lot of other sources. You're going to be citing these sources in your paper. You're going to certainly going to have less writing within engineering. You're not going to have no writing because I know that there are some courses in which you're going to be writing lab reports. You're probably also going to be drawing on sources for some of the information that you're including in those reports. And so it's important to understand first, how are you, like, kind of the idea of knowing if you are using information from another source, somehow you need to give credit for it. And so conceptually, it's important to understand that. Now, mechanically, that's going to play out differently depending upon what citation style you are using. And so while you may use APA style in a psychology class, you might use Chicago style in a history class. And so it's going to vary by discipline, just like with engineering and some of the sciences are going to have specific requirements. And so it's important for you to understand what citation style is this particular class requiring and what are the mechanics of how to do that. And so knowing that typically when you're citing, it's more than just listing your references at the end of the assignment. Usually there is going to be some kind of citation within the body of the text that indicates, these exact words came from this source, these ideas came from this source, because even if you're paraphrasing somebody else's ideas, while those words are yours, those ideas still belong to somebody else. And it is important that we are giving credit to that person or those people whose ideas you are using as you are completing your own assignment. And so these are skills that are really important to learn early, because as you use them over and over again, you essentially get the most bang for your buck by knowing them earlier, and then you can avoid kind of having any issues. What I would say we see more often of within engineering tends to fall kind of within this idea of collusion. And so collusion is essentially the unauthorized collaboration when you are submitting work or preparing work that is going to be submitted for credit. And so I want to draw a distinction between collaboration and collusion. Collaboration is generally encouraged by your faculty, by the university. I would encourage students to study together. I think it is helpful to be able to learn the material when you are working with other people who may approach it differently than your faculty and may be able to teach you in another manner. It is great because it also tests your knowledge if you are trying to teach somebody else a particular concept. And so I think on the whole, collaboration is really good. Now, collusion is when you are collaborating, but you are not allowed to do so. And so that's going to beg the question, well, how do I know when I am allowed to work together and when am I not? Your professor is going to tell you, or your professor is going to determine that essentially. And so each faculty member is going to define what the kind of parameters are for their classes, for their assignments and exams. They're going to determine when can you work together, when can you not work together. For example, you may be in a biology class and you have a lab group. And so there may be 4 of you, or let's just say a lab partner. So you have one other student that you guys are lab partners and you are working together to do an experiment. And so you run the experiment in the lab. You both are taking, you're taking the same measurements, the same data from this lab. So now, and this is part of the exercise, your professor has said you two work together on this, do the experiment together, take the data together. So both of you are going to have the same data. You're going to have the same measurements. Now, the second part of this exercise is going to be your lab report. And the faculty says, once you have done the experiment together and taken your data together, your lab report should be written separately and independently. So there is going to be similarity in as much as you both are using the same data. And so that is going to show up in both of your reports. But otherwise, the actual writing of the report should be done individually. And so while you are permitted to collaborate and work together in the initial part, you would not be permitted to do so in the later part. And so if, for instance, you both were talking about how you're going to write your lab report, or you were even submitting some of the same paragraphs, that would be collusion because your professor has said, no, you can't work together when you're actually writing the report itself. And so what I tell faculty and I tell students is that it's important to make sure that you're on the same page with clear expectations. And there is certainly a lot of gray in this because each faculty member is different in that some may allow you to work together in ways that others will not allow you to work together. And it's going to depend. And so don't assume what was okay in one class is going to be okay in another class. The same is true even if you have an instructor as a freshman who you then have again, let's say as a junior, their expectations may even be different between those two classes, even though it's the same professor. And so don't assume. And so you want to make sure that you know what the expectations are clearly, that you have read what those are, and you've asked those questions. And it's good to be specific, and it's good to use examples, because sometimes when we say things, and this is anybody, it is possible for two people to hear the exact same words, but come away with different meanings. And so using examples is helpful with that, to be able to ask your professor, you know, this is specifically what I want to do. Is this okay? Is this not okay? And as faculty have those conversations with students, it's also helpful for the rest of the class, because ideally, we want to prevent things from happening in the first place. And so this way we keep everybody on the same page. Now, just kind of some examples that come out of these policies. We've talked about some of these, you know, copying from others, you know, going online and copying answers from other websites. You know, generally, you know, I talk about Chegg because this definitely comes up in engineering a lot and some of the other disciplines, but there's a difference between I'm trying to get help to understand a concept and getting a solution. And so if you are using a site to try to understand a concept, maybe this is how this particular function within Python works. This is the syntax on how to utilize it. That's one thing. And that's generally going to be okay. But if you're looking for like an example that solves your problem for you, or a solution to the problem itself, that is going to be a different issue, and that is likely going to be a violation if you are copying it. And so, you know, my general advice is that you don't want to be looking for specific solutions, because that's usually going to lead you to something that is crossing a line. It's tough to use some of these sites and kind of self-regulate without being kind of really in tune with the expectations and what you're looking at. Sometimes it's much easier, and I would encourage you to use the university resources because they're going to generally know where those lines are, particularly your faculty, because they're the ones defining them for you. I would say, please don't share your work with other students and don't get somebody else's work. That would actually eliminate quite a few issues if students just safeguarded their work. Please, even after the course is over, please don't pass your old assignments down to other students who then may end up copying it. There are many times where we see students copying somebody's assignment from their friend who took it in the semester before. And part of why it also happens to stand out is because the assignment itself changed slightly. And so the students are copying things that aren't even required in the current assignment anymore, but they were in the previous semester. And so it stands out to your faculty when they are then doing the grading. Talking to others while taking an exam. Now, something to start thinking about is it's very easy for me to sit here and say, you know, don't cheat, don't plagiarize. You know, we have this honor code, we have these policies, and so you just shouldn't violate it. That is both simple and ineffective, in my opinion. And so what you need to be doing is think through the common situations that you have already found yourself in, that you might find yourself in, and start thinking about how you would react in those. Similarly, think about the reasons why you might cheat on an assignment. Certainly not you, but perhaps think about the reasons why your friend may cheat on an assignment. So I have a list that I'm going to put up here. It is not exhaustive at all. And I would imagine many of the reasons that you might be thinking about are going to show up on this list. And so when there's a problem, it's one thing to simply treat the symptoms, but I think it's more effective to be treating the root cause of it. And so what we want to do is look at those root causes. And I would say, for example, poor time management is very high on the list. That students, The reason that they ended up, say, copying their friend's assignment was because they ran out of time. And maybe that, different people have different things on their plates, but learning how to manage your time well is going to be, it's a lifelong skill that is not quickly mastered, that may take your whole life to continue to improve upon, but working at that is going to help you. For many students, it's simply a matter of confidence. Many students that I know have told me, you know what, I even had the right answer, but I copied my friend because I just thought they were smarter than me, and they didn't trust in themselves to be able to do the work. Some that may be unprepared, whether that's for a specific exam or they may just be unprepared for the course itself. Particularly when you are in a field that can be difficult to learn, and you're going to have these more fundamental classes early on, and then your other classes are going to build on them. And your faculty that are teaching these more advanced classes, they're going to expect that you have the skills, the basic skills, before getting there. And I know some students feel incredibly outgunned when they go into a class and they realize their peers are so much further along than they are, and they struggle. And then it is in that struggling that they end up then cheating on an assignment or an exam. And so you need to put that time in early to be able to have a really good grasp of the fundamentals as you continue to advance. What students see their peers doing, or even what they perceive their peers are doing, plays such an outsized role in whether a student is going to engage in academic misconduct or not. And there have been experiments and studies that have been done. And so besides reviewing those, even in the work that our office has done, where we have looked at all these situations that involve large groups of students and seen how over time the amount of cheating would have increased in a class once students start seeing others cheating and getting away with it. And there are many students that never would have cheated in the first place, but for the fact that they saw their peers cheating or they thought they were. And so they were doing so in order to just keep a level playing field, essentially. And so it's important to recognize that not everybody does, but also to make sure that you are an example for your peers as well. We see it from high achieving and low achieving students. We know that you have pressure. You all have families that probably have expectations of you. You may have pressure to maintain certain grade point levels, whether to maintain a scholarship or to maintain your standing within UTA, to be able to get into a particular program, to be able to advance to the next class. Some that are just maybe cheating just because they need to pass the class, some because they have to have an A, and that is how they are going to go about getting it. Some do it because they don't understand what the policies are. And so this is a little bit a part of that, trying to talk through what's, some of these policies, how they might apply. For some, it's habits. For some, that maybe came from a different educational system where there's a different set of norms. And, what was previously allowed at their old school no longer is allowed at UTA. And so understanding what some of those differences are. Certainly there could be an ethical component to this, but usually it's going to be, like I've heard students say, well, yes, I did this, it was a mistake, but I'm not a cheater. And, what I will generally say is, I'm not in any position to judge your character. Everybody makes mistakes. That is part of formal education. You all do that every day because none of you all are getting 100% on every single assignment or an exam. This is not all that different in many ways. And so, if mistakes get made, we learn from it. We take steps to try to correct it and, do better in the future. It doesn't have to define you. And so it's kind of up to you on the choices that you're going to make. And so when we're talking about prevention, be thinking about that list that I was giving as kind of those underlying reasons. And then we start to think about, okay, knowing that I may find myself, up against some of these, some of the things in that list, what steps can I take that's going to help either help me avoid being in that situation, or that if I am in that situation, make the right choice or to make it as good as it can be. And so we talked about making sure you understand your professor's expectations and asking questions. Read the syllabus and the assignment instructions. And I don't just mean when assignments are due. I know everybody looks at, well, most people look at when assignments are due. I will tell you, I have taught a number of classes over the years. In my syllabi, I used to hide a line that said, when you read this, send your instructor an email with the following in the subject line. I will tell you, nobody has ever sent me an email with that in the subject line. And what that tells me is that students were not carefully reading my syllabus from start to finish. And so it's worth spending the time to do that. One of the easiest ways to meet somebody's expectations is to simply know what they are. And so knowing the syllabus and reading the assignment instructions and what the guidelines are is going to be important. Same is true of announcements being made in Canvas by your faculty, or things that your faculty tell you in class. So you should go to class, because if you're not in class, you may not hear those announcements, and that's important information. We talked about time management skills, starting on assignments early. I recognize that is not necessarily easy. It's much easier said than it is done, but it's still good advice nonetheless. And so starting on it early gives you the most amount of time to work on it. It also can allow you time to step away from it and then come back if it's a particularly difficult problem, and then you might be able to approach it in a different way. We talked about not sharing or exchanging assignments. As far as exams go, this slide is really specific to exams. Arrive early. Make sure you have all study materials put away. So any note sheets or anything, make sure it is all away, secured, bags closed, phone is away, phone is off. There's no reason to be answering a phone during your test. Put it in your bag and just out of sight so that you're not rushing as the exam is being passed out. Make sure you have any approved materials already with you. So for instance, like if your professor allows you to use a calculator, please have it with you already and make sure it is the correct calculator. Sometimes there are specifications on what type of calculator you can have. If you have a pencil that you are using, say for a Scantron exam or otherwise, have an eraser with you. Please don't ask your neighbor for an eraser while you are taking the test. The person who is proctoring the exam is not going to know why you're talking to somebody else, but they are going to see you talking. And it is better to just avoid even the appearance of cheating than it is to try to sort it out later. I generally tell faculty that it's a good idea to have a seating chart for exam day. I will tell you as students, sit by whoever you want during class, whenever you're normally in class. When it comes to exams, I would recommend don't sit by anybody you know. Don't sit by your friends, and don't sit by anybody that you just casually know from class. Studies have shown that students are less likely to cheat when they are sitting by people they don't know than by people they do know. People may feel more comfortable asking somebody for something or maybe looking at somebody else's answer when they know them than when they don't. And so it doesn't make you a bad friend. You guys can get together after class, after the exam is over, but I would say don't sit by people you know. It takes some of that temptation away. Sorry. I mentioned like with the eraser example, please don't talk to anybody else while taking an exam, and please don't look around while you're taking an exam. I know at times, especially, the exam is mentally draining and you might just be staring at nothing and just staring kind of into the ether. somebody who is looking on may not be able to tell the difference between I'm staring off at nothing and I'm staring over and I'm looking at somebody else's answers. And so it's easier, especially if you need to give your eyes a break, like you can look down at your own test, you can close your eyes, but trying to kind of stay within your own plane there. And to cover your answers, you know, a lot of these rooms, I know we are crunched for space. It'd be great if we could space everybody out more, and unfortunately, it's just not possible oftentimes. And so trying to do your best to at least cover your answers. I think that also just helps further the cause in general. And and then it can keep everybody, you know, doing their own exams. This may sound kind of crazy, but just sometimes be okay with submitting work that might not be your best, but at least it's still yours and not also partially somebody else's. There are a lot of students I've talked to that have told me, you know, I wish I had just turned it in. Like I didn't even have that much to gain by cheating on this, but I did anyway. And it's not worth it. So like, for instance, if your faculty, let's say if they give people a 0 if they cheat on an assignment, you could turn in something that's really poor. A 40% would be better than a 0. Plus you don't have to deal with the cheating violation as well. And so sometimes, you know, like the work just isn't good. Turn it in, you know, it is what it is. And you learn from that experience and you try to do better next time. But be okay that, and, you know, take responsibility for that you will get the grade that was earned by, you know, what you put into that. And certainly if you're unhappy with that, you know, that's when you take steps next time to try to correct it. It's important to know what the policies are. So not just in the syllabus, but also with UTA in general. We talked a little bit about some of those study websites. GroupMe is a great tool, and GroupMe is not the only tool. I mean, I know there's just general texting in general, there's WhatsApp, there's Discord, all kinds of messaging apps that allow students to connect with one another, which is great. You know, it's nice to have that community. It's nice to have that group that can help provide answers to questions, not test questions, but like, hey, when's this due? What pages do we have to read for today? Just don't use it to cheat on things, like to exchange actual assignments or exams, exam content. UTA is a big place. We have tons of stuff available for students to be successful. And so it's just a matter sometimes of going and asking and going and getting it. You know, faculty, the TAs in your classes, the extra lab sessions that are put on to be able to go work on things, the tutoring that is available in different ways for specific classes, supplemental instruction where you're getting additional instruction as a group, the librarians that, especially as they have their own subject matter expertise, the entire division of student success and the coaching and the sessions that they offer. There are so many things that are here for you. You just have to take advantage of it. But they're here for you, and you should start to learn what is here. Start to make out a list. You may not need it now. In some ways, it's still early in the semester, but it's better to ask for help earlier than later. Oftentimes, if you're not going to see your faculty until right before finals, you may not have as much of a chance at that point. If you have done poorly all semester long and you have a cumulative final, it's probably unrealistic that you're hitting like a 95 on it to salvage a grade. And so the time to go for help is going to be earlier rather than later. It's kind of like there's a saying, the best time to plant a tree is 10 years ago, but the next best time to plant a tree is today. And so I think at the first sign that you are hitting some challenges or some struggling a little bit is to start to look at where can I go for help and how to fix that. You know, we talked about understanding the fundamentals before you get to the more advanced courses, being willing to put in the time that is needed. There are coaches that have talked about players that they have coached over the years and how Some were just more willing to put the preparation in that was needed in order to excel. You know, these are the players that, you know, outside of the 3 hours of practice that they already had, they were showing up to practice early and they were staying at practice afterwards. And they were continuing to strategize and think about what are the things that they need to be doing to be the best at what it is that they are doing. And this is not just isolated to athletics. This is anything, any skill that you want to be good at. There is often no substitute for putting in the time that is needed. I know Malcolm Gladwell talks about, you know, needing 10,000 hours to master something, but you have to be willing to put in that time. There's generally not a quick fix to it. If you see something, say something, and I'll explain what I mean. Oftentimes, we talked about kind of the idea of students observing or thinking that others are cheating also. You know, I've read through a lot of GroupMe threads where there's cheating going on. And so I have students that'll ask me, you know, what do I do in this situation? Because like, I don't want to be in trouble. Like if somebody, you know, takes all these screenshots of this GroupMe thread and sends them to my professor, like I don't want my professor to think that I'm cheating on this test. So what do I do? Well, you say something. You have options. You could report it yourself. You could report something to a faculty member. You could report something directly to our office. That's one option. I recognize that in my experience, most students are more hesitant to do that. There's still a certain kind of code, sense of loyalty, not wanting to inform on a peer of something they see. But that's not your only option. You know, besides that, you have the option to say something to that person. Sometimes that's all it takes. You know, using GroupMe as an example. You know, if you see people starting to engage in cheating, say something. Say something to the group that says, you know what, we shouldn't be having this discussion. You shouldn't be asking for answers or posting this or sending this out. That might be enough for somebody to change their behavior and say, you know what, I shouldn't have asked for this. Please don't send me anything. I'm not going to do anything with this. And then at that point, no one has to be in trouble, but they have still changed their behavior and haven't continued on through that. And that's a win for everybody. And so there are many things in this world where many problems that may not exist if others were willing to stand up and say something. It certainly takes some courage to do that, but it can be worth it. And it can go a long way because that also shows your peers that there are others that say, you know what, this is not acceptable in our community and we don't want to see it. And it's going to reinforce the good decisions that people are going to make. And that's important. A little bit about our office. You know, the overarching philosophy, we want to be educational and developmental for students. That's even part of why I'm here today, is to try to educate you all proactively. We're here to make sure that students' due process rights are upheld, that we're upholding the integrity of the UTA degrees. We want to promote competency. We want to make sure you are good at what you do, that you are making good decisions, that you're thinking about the impact that the choices that you make have on the greater community, and that we're promoting a culture of integrity at UTA. And so I know that nobody listening to this right now is going to even need this information, but you might have a friend that does. And so you can be the one that educates your friend should they ever find themselves in the position where their faculty member thinks that they cheated on something. Now, faculty are not required to speak with students. We certainly encourage them to do so. And so your professor may reach out to say, you know what, I'm concerned about this. I want to talk to you about this. And then they may submit a referral to our office. Typically that referral form, some students may tell their faculty member, you know what, I did this and I'm sorry, I take full responsibility. They may sign that form indicating that they've accepted responsibility. And when we get those signed forms in, typically, especially if it's a student's first violation, we are not going to schedule an additional meeting. You've already met with your faculty to discuss it. You're not disputing this. We're going to send you an outcome letter that says, you've accepted responsibility for this. Here are the sanctions. Please don't do this again. For those where a student doesn't sign the form, either because they choose not to, their faculty member never asked them about it, maybe faculty never talked to you about it, we're going to then be the first one to reach out to the student. We're going to send typically an initial letter, maybe a summons letter that schedules a meeting. But, it's going to include information about the policy that was allegedly violated. It's going to include the evidence that's already been provided. Typically, if a case is not resolved at the time that final grades are due, the student is assigned an incomplete. That incomplete is just temporary until the case is ultimately resolved. Now, for students that are responsible for an academic misconduct violation, typically on a first violation, it's going to be a warning. Maybe if it's a little bit more serious, they'd be on disciplinary probation. And we're going to give you something educational to complete that relates to the nature of the violation, because we want you to learn from this. Now, on a second violation, maybe at that point, you've already been warned, so now you're going to be on disciplinary probation. Maybe, the first one was also serious. Now the second one is serious. Maybe a student is being suspended. Certainly possible to be suspended or expelled right out of the gate if it's really serious, but that generally does not happen very often. But we want this to be a learning experience so that you can change your behavior, your decision-making process, and then have better outcomes in the future. The grade penalty that gets imposed, that is always determined by the faculty member of the course. So if a student is responsible, your faculty is the one that assigns a grade. And then we will always copy the faculty on those outcome letters so that they know the case is resolved, and then they can assign you a grade. I have covered a lot of information, but I also wanted to make sure that we left time for questions at the end. This has information, contact information for our office. You can get in touch with us by email, by phone. Tells you where we are. We're in the basement of the University Center. And so we're here to help. We're here. We get questions all the time from students, from faculty, from staff. And so we want to be a resource for you all. But at this point, with the time that we have left, are there questions that I can answer? Dr. Tiernan, I think you are muted.
So sorry, I've been talking.
That's okay.
So we don't have any student questions, but I did want to bring up one quick question. In particular, because we've had so many online tests and they're still continuing in many classes. So many tests online are using the lockdown browser and Respondus Monitor. What kind of behaviors are often looked at as being cheating when faculty members are looking at these recorded tests? So sure. What are you seeing?
Sure. Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And let me answer that. I'm going to add to it. So typically, what faculty are looking for in those are going to be, do they see a student in possession of unauthorized materials? This could be other papers, it could be a phone, it could be other people in the room with them. And so they're going to look for, am I seeing any of these things? The other thing that a faculty is going to typically look for is going to be, what is a student looking at while taking the test? And so usually most webcams are built into a student's laptop oftentimes, and so usually they're looking straight on at the screen. Sometimes it may be in a different place. Sometimes they may have an external webcam, but a faculty member is really going to be looking at, how does it appear that a student is looking at the test itself, and then are they deviating from that? And are they deviating from that to the same place? And so it's, I think from an academic integrity standpoint, online exams and followed by in-person exams, those are some of the hardest cases to kind of sort through. Unlike sports, we don't get replays from 6 or 7 different angles. We usually, there's just one video. And so with that, it's important, I think, for students to, number one, be aware of what your body is doing. It is not easy to sit in the exact same position with the exact same everything for an entire exam, but trying to be cognizant of what your body is doing. And I would say try not to be looking around. The other thing that I suggest, I make this suggestion both for faculty as well as students, is that having a really good environment scan can be useful. So the reason that faculty may have students do an environment scan is so before the test starts, you essentially scan your work area and the surrounding area in the room. And your faculty are going to have you do that because they want to make sure that you don't have things like a phone in place or other papers, or that you have other people there. And so they're trying to make sure that you are taking the test in a secure environment since there's no live proctor there. For students, having a good environment scan is important because if you are looking away from the screen, it's helpful to be able to go back and say, look, I showed you everything in my room. Like there is nothing I would have been looking at. And so, you know, I have this great scan to support that. For those that may not do any scan, then it leaves open like what might a student have had, what might they not have had. And so I tell students, it's in your interest to do a really good scan. I would also recommend that students clear your area before you ever do the scan, before you ever get ready to start. Go to the bathroom before you are getting ready to take the test. Like get in the mindset and pretend like you are taking this test on campus in a room that you're going to have somebody there watching. Because when we take an exam in the comfort of our own room, there's a comfort level to that. And so it may feel less formal. A student may never ever think about looking at their phone while they're in a lecture hall taking a test, but they'll pick up their phone and order dinner while they're taking in the middle of an exam online in their room. And it may just be ordering dinner, but your faculty member is going to say, you can't be on a phone while you're taking your test. And it's not that a student didn't know it, but the mindset is just different between like being in person versus online. And so trying to think about how would I take this test if I were in a lecture hall? Like, I know I couldn't have had other materials out in a lecture hall, so then you don't want to have them out at all during an online exam. And trying to make sure you're doing it in a private place. Even if that means just reserving a room on campus, but trying to have a space where you're not going to have people coming and going, you know, making sure it's quiet and everything, and that you're kind of following those guidelines. And so hopefully that answers the question, but I also wanted to talk about it from the standpoint of these are things that you can do to try to help avoid even the appearance of cheating.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Let me give you one more question because we're almost out of time. So you gave us the philosophy of the Office of Student Conduct. What would you say is the goal for your office when you work with students who have committed an academic dishonesty offense? What is your goal and your colleagues' goals for the student?
I would say, so the goals are going to be to help a student. Well, it's kind of twofold. There's going to be the goal of need to determine kind of the facts of what happened, because ultimately a decision has to be made in the case. And so we're talking about, you know, from the conduct process, the evidentiary process of that. The other goal is going to be the education of a student. And so it's trying to understand what happened and kind of what led to this. And also just kind of what's going on with a student in general. So most students that I talk to, it's not limited, the conversation is not limited to just what happened in this specific incident, but it's also going to include, how's the semester going? How are your classes going? Do you feel ready for finals? And so it's being a, what's your major? It's being able to take kind of that academic integrity piece, figure out what are the underlying things that might have contributed to them being in there in the first place, and then how do we get students connected, made aware of the different resources that are available on campus, and how do we both ask questions and kind of talk students through so that they learn from the mistakes that happened and then don't repeat them. And so like I can use the example of the last student I spoke with, who was adamant, didn't plagiarize on something, but then, as we talk through it, can see, okay, yeah, it is plagiarized, but basically didn't quite understand what plagiarism was. And so really kind of being able to talk about that, but even beyond just, one specific assignment, but being able to talk through like, what is your writing process? Like, how do you go about doing these assignments? Let's talk through strategies where you're going to find more success than just like, because it can't just be, well, just don't do this again, but it's how do we give you the tools so that you can succeed, not just in this specific instance, but that it's going to apply to many other situations that you would find yourself in. Because also what we don't want happening is a student that says, okay, well, I understand just this one aspect of the policy. I won't do that again. I'm just going to violate all these other pieces of the policy one by one. We don't want that either. And so we want students to be able to realize their own goals that they have and then to be successful. And what's unique about our office is that unlike programs that different areas will put on, students don't always get to students can't necessarily self-select into our process. They choose whether to go to a program or not, but if they're accused of cheating, they almost have to kind of participate in our process in one form or another. And so we provide that touch point that can then get them connected in to other areas on campus, even if they would not have otherwise sought it out, but now we can at least be that entity that tries to help them do that.
Dan, thank you so much for joining us today. It's always so important for our students to understand academic integrity as well as the processes that we use here at the university. But I really appreciate your presentation and thank you for all that you do for our students, because part of this process we know is if they do make this mistake, getting them back on the right track so that they're a successful student at UTA. And we appreciate how your office does that for us. So thanks again for attending. For all you attendees, we are very happy to have had you with us today. We want to remind you that upcoming brown bags are listed on the schedule. It's in the chat right now, but you can also just Google search for the UTA virtual brown bags in the College of Engineering. We'll have lots of other topics coming up, and we hope you will be able to join us for those. So thank you again, and have a great afternoon.